I'm coming up on the first anniversary of my life with a cochlear implant, which seems like a good time for a reality check. Would I do it again? Spoiler alert, yes, in a heartbeat. But how is it with that holy grail of cochlear implants? Music appreciation. Well, just over a year ago, I knew nothing about cochlear implants. And so this former professional audio nerd sent himself to school learning what cochlear implants are, how they work, who makes them, and what real world users actually think about them. I pretty much knew that there was no way that 16 or so electrodes were going to equal the thousands of hair cells in a healthy, functioning ear. And I knew that the little plastic encased microchip hanging off of my ear couldn't hold a candle to the majestic power of the human brain, even mine. So, given those limitations, I think that I went into this with fairly realistic expectations. And I'm happy to say they've been met. I expected my implant and paired hearing aid to give me back a good understanding of speech, and they did. I also expected to eventually be able to enjoy music again, but that it would probably not sound very good. Well, I do, and it doesn't. But at least I've learned enough to understand why and what the future might hold that gives me reason to be optimistic. But before getting into what might make music sound better, it would probably be useful to take a look at why music right now kind of sucks. You've probably seen images like these in ads or brochures from the various cochlear implant manufacturers. They show that their device can produce the resolution required to determine the difference between any two notes on a standard keyboard. This is called pitch resolution, and it's one of the reasons that I went with advanced bionics. Med-L can theoretically stimulate lower frequencies because their longer arrays can penetrate deeper into the cochlea, where the low frequencies like to hang out. Why didn't I choose Med-L if they can produce lower frequencies? Well, in my case, I had sloping hearing loss that left me with little ability to hear high frequencies, but not a completely terrible ability to hear low frequencies. And since I figured natural is better than electrically stimulated, I'd gamble that surgery wouldn't completely cost me my ability to naturally hear low frequencies, and so they could be boosted acoustically using what's called electroacoustic stimulation, or an acoustic ear hook in the case of advanced bionics. It's a little hearing aid like speaker that fits in my ear canal. In my case, the bet paid off. When I stream test tones, I can now hear from 20 hertz, the effective lower limit of human hearing, all the way up to where my cochlear implant takes over. That means I can also now hear every note on the keyboard, all 88 keys, just like they promised. Cool. But the problem isn't what they promised. The problem is what they didn't even mention when showing us those keyboards. You see, while I actually can discern a difference between each note on the keyboard, few of them are perceived accurately. And that's probably true for pretty much any of us with a cochlear implant. In a second, I'll explain why that pitch inaccuracy occurs, but first of all, I want to talk about why it tends to make music sound so much worse than, say, a friend's voice or wind chimes or things like that. The answer? Well, basically, it comes down to math. You see, music is pretty much all about defined mathematical relationships. With the cochlear implant, if your preferred music consisted of simple, pure tones played one at a time, it may not sound too bad to you. If you have perfect pitch, you might quibble with how accurately it's being played, but there's a decent chance that you'd be able to hear the artist's intent. But music, generally speaking, doesn't consist of simple tones played one at a time. Music differs from other types of sound in one important way: harmonic content. Take a lovely three-part harmony. There's a root note and maybe a couple harmonic parts above that. Let's say you've worked with your audiologist and maybe even adopted my deactivate span method to get your basic pitch of your implant to match the real world. Let's say that that root note is A at 440 hertz. And let's say for the sake of argument that you've managed to get your implant to accurately present 440 hertz to your brain. Cool. That A note sounds pretty much the same on both sides of my head. My CI and my hearing aid agree with each other. So now let's add two notes above it to make an A major chord. That would be C sharp at 554 hertz and E at 659 hertz. And for good measure, we'll add an octave above that root note, which simply means that we double the root frequency. So A, an octave above our root note of 440 hertz, is 880 hertz. So as you can see, it's just math. Music notes with simple ratios of the root note, like 2 to 1, which is an octave, or 2 to 3, which is a perfect fifth, are generally pleasing to the ear, at least to a healthy, normal ear. It makes sense and is immutable and unchanging. The mathematical relationship between the notes is the same, no matter where the root note is. Music becomes discordant and displeasing if we break these mathematical relationships. It's the difference between Chopin and a cat walking across your piano keyboard. The other side of this harmonic coin is about the sequence of overtones that make individual instruments sound like they do. Take this note, shown as a simple pure tone frequency, no overtones. Compare that to the same note, but played on a saxophone. You can see the same root frequency, plus these various overtones that, along with the shape of the waveform, make a sax sound like a sax. Different instruments have different orders and levels of these overtones that make each sound unique. So we can see that accurate hearing of overtones in music makes harmonies sound musical and make individual instruments sound like what they are. So what happens when you can hear the difference between notes, like I can, and like the brochure promised us, but that difference between notes is random instead of mathematically ordered? You know, the part they left out of the brochure? Well, music sounds less like music and more like a cat walking on the keyboard. But why is that the case? Well, part of the answer is resolution. 3,000 healthy hair cells are being replaced by 16 or so electrodes. Think of it as audio pixelization. Resolution is limited, and so sound gets assigned by the brain to places it wouldn't go in a healthy ear. Your brain throws up its hands and does the best it can with what it has to work with. The other part has to do with an emerging understanding of how frequency perception is distributed throughout the ear. My implant array has neatly spaced electrodes laid out in a nice even line, just like the keyboard in the fancy brochure. Your cochlea, however? Well, researchers are finding that its own layout isn't that linear. Nature is messy. So a keyboard with nice evenly spaced keys, with each semitone being the same precise mathematical distance from the next, doesn't match the average cochlea. The keyboard might have to look more like this in order to be accurate to your ear. Now, as I talked about in another video, the higher the frequencies get, the less precise is our ability to detect changes in pitch. Inaccuracy at high frequencies doesn't matter as much to us, and in nature, the harmonic content of sound tends to be mathematically random anyway. So when I listen to a bubbling fountain on a spring day sitting out on the deck with birds chirping, it can sound correct and accurate and really good to me. It might sound different to someone with perfect hearing, but I don't care. To my ear, it sounds great. But that three-part harmony, well, I may have gotten that root frequency where it needs to be, but that C sharp and E above it sound randomly higher than the expected pitch. Now, this is a broad oversimplification of how pitch perception in a healthy ear-brain system actually works, but it does explain a big part of why so many people with cochlear implants are getting great speech scores in the booth, but still report dissatisfaction with music. But there is hope that things can get better, and a lot of people who are way smarter than I am are working on this very problem as we speak. The solutions may involve different and more flexible allocation of the frequencies that more accurately reflects the real-world tonotopic layout of the average cochlea. It may mean more advanced versions of the post-implant imaging and customization currently offered by Med-El, or maybe implementing programming that more closely mimics the various strategies that our natural hearing system uses to hear pitches accurately. But much of it may turn out to depend on us and our brain's inherent ability to adapt to new realities. In other words, there may be no quick fix. But perhaps in time, my majestic brain will learn how to make musical sense out of this new method of stimulation that I had shoved into my head a year ago. I'll close with an exchange I had on Facebook recently with an advanced bionics user who's been implanted for 20 years. She echoed the sentiments of many, but not all, long term implantees in saying that music finally sounds wonderful to her. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. As a lifelong music lover and occasional player, that's music to my ears. Sorry, I couldn't resist. That was pretty lame. In the meantime, I wish you all well on your hearing journeys and thanks for watching.